Snow had been falling since early morning, a steady curtain that erased the world 1 inch at a time. By dusk, it had risen past Mason's boots, burying the stone steps of his little ridge-side cabin, and frosting the window panes in white lace. No one traveled this high in winter, not unless they were desperate or dying. Mason Merritt, chimney hand and half Apache drifter, knew that well enough. He spent Christmas Eve the only way he'd spent the last 5 Christmas Eves, patching what the wind had torn loose. The storm had rattled his stovepipe again, and he was crouched on the roof with a hammer in one hand, cold iron biting into his palm. The air stung his face like a fistful of needles. Every breath came out as steam. He muttered to himself, "This ridge has got a mean streak, same as always." Yes, when he climbed down, boots sinking deep into the powder, he noticed how quiet the valley had become. No coyotes yipping, no wind skimming the treetops. Just the heavy stillness that came before a worse snowsnow that smothered sound as quick as it smothered tracks. Mason moved inside, shaking off the cold. He stoked the stove, rubbed his hands, then reached for the kettle. The lamplight cast long amber shadows across the tall room. Single cot, small workbench, one set of dishes, everything orderly, the way only a lonely man keeps it. He'd just settled onto the stool when it came. 3 hard, desperate pounds on the door. Not the uncertain tap of a lost traveler. Not the knock of a neighbor. Not. This was the sound of someone pounding with the last strength left in their bones. Mason froze, heart thudding once, twice. No one climbed this ridge. Not in December. Not through a storm like this. The pounding came again, weaker this time. He rose, fingers brushing the knife on the table by instinct, not fear, just the habit of a man who'd lived too many years alone. He reached the door and pulled it open a crack. Wind slammed into him, first cold enough to scrape the skin raw. Then he saw her, a young woman, no more than 27, swayed in the doorway as if the storm itself were holding her upright. Snow clung to her eyelashes, her cheeks were flushed red from bitter wind. Behind her, an old wagon lay half-collapsed. One wheel sunk to the hub in the drifts. A horse lay beside it, stiff as a fallen statue of ice. And leaning against the wagon were 2 elderly figures, barely able to stand. The young woman's lips trembled, but she forced the words out. "Please, sir, my parents can't walk any farther. We—" She caught her breath, voice breaking. "I beg you, let us stay for just one night." Mason's first instinct was caution. Strangers meant trouble sometimes. People lied. People stole. The world had taught him that more than once. But her eyes, Lord, her eyes were wide with the stubborn courage of someone who'd spent every last ounce of herself just keeping 2 old folks alive. The kind of courage that came from love, not desperation. And her hands raw, cracked. The hands of someone who worked harder than the world ever noticed. He pushed the door open wider. "Get inside," Mason said, voice low but steady, "before that storm finishes the job." The relief that washed over her nearly buckled her knees. He stepped forward and caught her gently by the arm, guiding her inside while the wind tore at their coats. Then he trudged back out to help her parents. The old man could barely stand. The woman's cough rattled so deep it echoed in her ribs. Mason wrapped an arm around each of them and half carried them into the warmth of the cabin. He shut the door hard against the gale. For a moment, no one spoke. The storm hissed against the walls like a living thing. Mason moved quickly, feeding the stove, throwing 2 more logs onto the fire. He filled tin cups with hot water and slid them into their cold hands. "Drink a little," he said. "Heat'll crawl back into your bones quicker that way. I'll fetch blankets." The young woman knelt beside her mother, blowing on the steaming cup before holding it to the old woman's lips. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but exhaustion. Mason returned with blankets and tucked them around the old couple. Their shivering eased, their breathing softened. Only then did he look back at the young woman. Snow was melting in her hair, dripping onto the wooden floor. She looked like someone who had run farther than any soul should ever have to run. "What's your name?" Mason asked. She hesitated, as if the answer itself might put them in danger. "Ellie," she said finally. "Ellie Hargrove. And these are my parents." Mason nodded once. "I'm Mason. You can rest here tonight." She blinked hard, eyes glassy. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't know if anyone would open their door to us." Mason shrugged lightly. "Storm like this doesn't give much choice. Nobody deserves to freeze on Christmas Eve." Outside, the wind howled over the ridge, flinging snow against the shutters. Inside, the stove crackled, filling the cabin with the warm smell of pine wood sap. Mason glanced at the three weary figures, now huddled under blankets. He had lived alone since his parents died, and silence had been his only company for years. Yet tonight, with a frightened baker and her aging parents sitting by his fire, the cabin felt strangely, unexpectedly alive. He muttered under his breath, almost to himself, "Looks like Christmas brought company after all." Ellie looked up at him, the faintest edge of hope kindling behind her exhaustion. And just like that, the long, cold night of the ridge no longer felt quite as empty. The storm thickened as the night deepened, piling snow against the sides of Mason's cabin like a white tide. The wind rattled the shutters, shook frost loose from the eaves, and ride down the chimney like some old spirit denied shelter. But inside, warmth began piece by piece to take root. Mason set another log on the fire and watched the flames lick upward, casting copper light over the small room. Ellie and her parents huddled close to the stove, their shoulders still trembling from the cold that had cut into them for miles. He carried over 3 tin cups brimming with steaming water. "Here," he said, voice low but firm. "Take a sip. Heat'll come back to you little by little. I'll fetch more blankets." Ellie accepted the cup with both hands, as if it were something sacred. "Thank you," she whispered, breath fogging above the rim. Her mother coughed into the blanket Mason had wrapped her in. The old man beside her groaned softly as he tried to straighten his stiff legs. Mason didn't ask questions. The world had taught him that sometimes people hid the truth, not out of deceit, but out of fear of losing the last thing they had. He knelt, checking the father's legs with careful fingers. Numb, not frozen. "That's good," Mason murmured. "We'll warm him up." Ellie watched him with anxious eyes. He hasn't been able to walk since yesterday. The cold. It took everything out of him. Mason nodded, studying the furrows of pain etched into the old man's face. "He'll need rest, that's all. Rest and heat." He stood, ladled stew from the pot simmering on the stove, venison dried last fall, cubed potatoes, onions he'd saved for winter. It wasn't much, but he filled 3 bowls anyway. The cabin felt different as he moveless, like a lonely hideaway, more like a place meant for people. He muttered under his breath, almost a prayer, though he claimed no God. Saving folks comes first. Food. I can always hunt again. Ellie's mother and father dozed soon after eating. Their breathing softened. Color crept faintly back into their cheeks. Ellie tucked the blankets tighter around them, smoothing the edge near her mother's shoulder. Only when she was certain they slept did she finally allow herself to sag down beside Mason's workbench with a long, shaky exhale. Her hair had dried in soft waves from the fire's heat. Her hands, cracked and reddened by frost and labor, trembled in her lap. Mason had taken up a piece of cedar and whittling knife, letting his hands work while his mind settled. The soft rasp of blade on wood filled the small room. Ellie watched for a moment, before speaking. What are you carving?" Mason didn't look up at first. He brushed shavings aside and studied the forming shape. A meadowlark, he answered quietly. My mother carved birds like this when I was small. Said it kept winter from swallowing our spirits. Ellie's expression softened. It's beautiful, she said. Then after a breath, I'm sorry if our coming here made you think of painful things. Mason paused, blade hovering over the wood. Pain's an old friend, he said with a faint smile. It visits whether I invite it or not. Tonight, I reckon it's nice having someone else here to talk over it. Ellie wrapped her arms around her knees, drawing closer to the fire's glow. I didn't know what kind of folks lived this far up the ridge, she admitted softly. When we saw your cabin, I worried. People say frightening things about Apache men. Mason gave a dry, amused huff. People say all sorts of things, most of them wrong. Ellie's cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. They were wrong about you, she whispered. A quiet settled over them, not heavy like the silence Mason lived with, but warm, as if the cabin itself were listening. He set the carving aside and leaned back against the wall. So, he said gently, tell me what chased you up a mountain in the dead of winter. Ellie hesitated, eyes reflecting the firelight, like amber glass. Then the story came slowly, halting at first about her family's bakery, the debts they couldn't catch up to, the creditors who turned cruel when the money dried up. They'd smashed windows, broken shelves, threatened worse. And when they returned with torches 2 nights ago, Ellie had thrown what little she could onto the wagon and fled with her parents into the storm. Her voice wavered. I didn't know where else to go. I just kept pushing the wagon, hoping somewhere would take us in. Mason listened without interruption. When she finished, he didn't offer pity, just a quiet nod of understanding. The kind of understanding that came only from someone who had once run from life too. You did right by your folks, he said. Took courage to get him this far. She swallowed hard. I was so scared out there. But when I reached your door, something told me to knock. Storm would have swallowed you otherwise, Mason said. And you weren't ready to be swallowed. Her smile was small but real. No, I guess I wasn't. But the fire dimmed a little, settling into long, steady embers. Outside, snow whispered down the valley. The kind of night that froze breath in the air and left the land untouched except for the soft pulse of falling white. Ellie shifted closer, her shoulder brushing Mason's arm. You saved us, she said quietly. I won't forget that. Mason didn't move away. You're safe for tonight. We'll figure tomorrow when tomorrow comes. They sat like that for a long while, not speaking, letting the glow of the stove soften the edges of the long, brutal night. Ellie looked at peace for the first time since she'd stepped through the door. And Mason, who had lived so long with only silence for company, felt a strange, gentle warmth stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt since boyhood. A sense of being needed, a sense of being human again. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside the little cabin on the ridge, the world felt just a little less cold. Morning crept over the ridge slowly, casting pale light across snow-packed hills that stretched farther than the eye could travel. The storm had eased sometime before dawn, leaving the world still, hushed, as if holding its breath after a long night of howling. Mason opened the door to a blast of cold air and a sky so clear it almost seemed brittle. His boots sank into the powder as he stepped outside, brushing frost from the frame. Inside, behind him, Ellie was stirring awake. She blinked sleep from her eyes, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she checked on her parents. Her mother's coughing had softened through the night. Her father's breathing had steadied. Color faint, but unmistakable, had returned to their cheeks. Mason watched quietly from the doorway. You look better this morning, he said. Ellie gave him a tired smile. Because you kept us warm, Mason. He shrugged, not used to gratitude. Fire kept you warm. I just kept it fed. But she saw the truth in his actions, how he'd tended the stove through the whole night, checking it every hour to make sure the flames never dipped too low. How he had given up nearly all his winter stores without a second thought. As the day wore on, the cabin came alive with soft movement and simple chores. Ellie boiled water for her mother's cough. Mason chopped more firewood out back, the steady swing of his axe echoing between the frozen trees. The smell of bread, Ellie's leftover dough baked over the stove, drifted into the air, filling the tight cabin with a home-like warmth it had not known in years. Her father stirred awake around midday. "Mason," he murmured, voice still gravelly. "Did you carry me inside yourself?" Mason nodded. "Storm wasn't about to get you if I could help it." The old man gave a weak chuckle. "Then I owe you my hide." "You owe me nothing," Mason replied. "Just get your strength back." When Ellie's mother was strong enough to sit upright, she reached for Mason's hand with her frail fingers. "You're a good man," she whispered. "A rare thing these days." Mason felt his throat tighten, but only nodded once, gently pulling his hand away before the emotion could sit too long on his face. By late afternoon, Ellie had cleaned the small cabin with a quiet energy, wiping down the table, tidying the shelf of tools, setting blankets to dry near the stove. Every corner she touched seemed to brighten, as though the place were remembering it could be more than a shelter built for one lonely man. Mason came in from the cold, snow clinging to his coat. He stomped it off near the door, glancing around the transformed room. "Looks different in here," he said. Ellie swept a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "I just couldn't sit still while you did everything." "It's more than I ever bothered doing," Mason admitted. "Didn't realize how much a place changes when someone cares about it." Her cheeks warmed, though whether from the stove or his words, she wasn't sure. Later that evening, after her parents had fallen asleep again, Ellie helped Mason repair a loose plank near the stove. She held the lantern while he hammered the nails back into place. Their shoulders brushed once or twice in the cramped cabin, each touch sending a flutter of awareness through the quiet. "You do this kind of work every day?" she asked, watching him steady the board. "Most days." He grinned slightly. "Chimneys don't take kindly to cold weather. Folks in town call me when smoke starts filling their living rooms." "You must meet a lot of people." "Enough," he said simply. "Not many come this far up the ridge, though." "And you like it that way?" Mason thought for a moment before answering. "I used to. Violence was easier than losing someone again." His hands paused on the plank. "But these past 2 days, I don't mind the noise." Ellie felt her breath catch. She lowered the lantern a little. "I don't mind it either." A moment passed between them, quiet, warm, full of something unmimed. That night, after supper of venison stew and hot bread, Mason carved once more. Ellie watched him from across the table as little curls of cedar shaved away beneath his blade. "You carve every evening?" she asked. "When my hands won't sit still," he replied. "Keeps my mind from wandering too far." "To the past?" she asked gently. "To empty place," Mason corrected, though the sadness behind his smile gave her the answer anyway. Ellie traced the rim of her cup. "My father says every man needs something to hold on to in the winter, something that sings against the cold." Mason lifted a brow. Did he now? "He didn't mean it like that," she laughed softly. "But I suppose he wasn't wrong." He studied her face, the softness in her eyes, the exhaustion carried there, but also the strength beneath it. "You've done a lot for your folks," Mason said, "more than most would." "They raised me with every scrap they had," Ellie murmured. "Running was the least I could do." "Still took guts," Mason replied. She looked down, embarrassed by the praise. "I just didn't want them hurt." "Most people don't want trouble," Mason said. He paused, the carving knife resting on the half-shaped bird. But trouble found you anyway. Ellie's throat tightened. It always does. Mason leaned back, stretching his boots toward the fire. Not while you're here. That much I can promise. She looked up sharply, but his expression was steady, certain. Something in her chest eased, something she hadn't known had been clenched tight since the night she fled her ruined home. When Ellie finally rose to lay another blanket over her parents, Mason spoke again, softer than before. This cabin's been waiting a long while for voices like yours. Ellie turned back to him, firelight catching in her eyes. And I'm grateful you opened the door. Outside, snow drifted softly through the dark, whispering down the mountain, in a hush that carried no threat now, only the quiet of a world at rest. Inside, Mason's cabin felt warmer than it ever had in his 30 years of living. Not because of the fire, but because, for the first time in a long while, there was life in it. Winter on the ridge was a strange kind of quiet, too peaceful, almost as if the wind itself were catching its breath before stirring up something worse. For several days after Christmas, life in Mason's cabin settled into a rhythm that felt almost like Emily, almost like something either of them dared call a beginning. Each morning, Mason headed down toward the village to check on chimneys bent by the storm, earning just enough coin to keep the cabin stocked. Ellie stayed behind tending her parents, baking small loaves of bread over the stove, their sweet warmth filling the room and clinging to Mason's coat whenever he came home. Her parents grew stronger. Mrs. Hargrove's cough softened. Mr. Hargrove managed 2 short steps with Mason's help. Ellie's cheeks carried a color he hadn't seen the first night, more life than fear now. He found himself watching her whenever she moved about the cabin, the way she brushed hair behind her ear, the way she hummed softly when she kneaded dough. Sometimes their hands brushed in passing, and the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was childish, warm, olivey. But peace in the West never held for long. It was near sundown on the 4th day when Mason rode back from the village, sack of beans slung over one shoulder, smoke from half-dozen chimneys wisping behind him. The wind was biting again, stinging his cheeks, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were on Elion, the bread she might be pulling from the fire just about now. On the way, her smile curved soft at the corners when she greeted him at the door. He passed the general store when something bright and unfamiliar on the bulletin wall caught his eye. Paper. Fresh paper. Pinned too straight to be old. Mason pulled his horse to a stop. A notice fluttered lightly in the breeze, white, crisp, newly inked. He leaned closer. There, staring back at him from the center of the sheet, was Ellie's face. Under it, in bold strokes, wanted for debt and flight from claim. Substantial reward to any who report her location. Mason's blood turned to ice. He tore the notice from the wall, crumpling it in his fist. The reward amount printed along the bottom was high enough to tempt anyone desperate enough this winter, including men far worse than debt collectors. Someone in town saw her. Someone talked. Or someone guessed. He mounted again and drove his horse hard up the ridge. Ellie looked up the moment Mason burst through the door. One look at his face and her smile faded. Mason, what happened? He held out the notice. Her hands trembled when she took it. Her breath hitched. Her mother reached for her shoulder, sensing trouble without needing to read a word. They're looking for you, Mason said, voice low. Harder than before. They've posted it everywhere. Ellie swallowed, color draining from her face. What do I do now? We can't run forever. I can't keep dragging my parents across the country. Mason stepped closer. You're not dragging them. You're keeping them alive. But for how long? She whispered. As long as it takes, he answered without hesitation. I'll take you someplace they won't find you. Somewhere far from here. Her eyes widened, not in fear this time, but in a fragile, aching hope. Mason, I don't want you in danger because of me. He shook his head gently. Danger's just part of the road out here. But letting you face it alone, that ain't something I can do. For the first time since the night she'd arrived, Ellie stepped forward and gripped his hand tightly, as if holding on to warmth in a cold world. Thank you, she whispered. Mason opened his mouth to say more when a hard knock shook the door. Not polite, not hesitant. A demanding, angry knock. Ellie's face drained again. Mason's expression sharpened. He nodded toward the back. Barn. Now. She gathered her skirts and darted toward the small storage shed attached to the cabin. Mason waited until she was out of sight, then squared his shoulders and opened the door. A tall man stood outside, wrapped in a gray coat dusted with snow, a revolver visible at his hip. His breath steamed in the cold. His eyes were narrow and searching. Evening, the man growled. You seen this woman? He shoved a copy of the poster into Mason's chest. Mason didn't glance down. I haven't seen her, he replied, voice flat as a stone. The man leaned forward, eyes sliding past Mason's shoulder into the cabin. I'd like to look around. Mason shifted, filling the doorway entirely. I hate strangers stepping into my home. That's so. The man's smile thinned. You sure you ain't hiding something, Apache? Mason's jaw tightened. My house, he said calmly. My rules. For a moment, the man looked ready to push past him. His hand twitched toward the revolver, not fully drawn, but not resting either. The tension was thick enough to taste. Then the wind gusted, carrying sleet across his coat. He cursed under his breath. Fine, he spat. But if I find out you're lying, I'll be back. Mason didn't blink. Doors'll be locked. The man turned sharply and trudged down the ridge, boots vanishing into the snow. Ellie stepped out of the barn once Mason shut the door. Her face was pale, her breath shaking. He didn't see me? No, Mason said. He won't stop looking, though. We have to leave soon. Before dawn. Ellie nodded, then hesitated, her eyes moving over Mason's face with a mix of fear, gratitude, and something deeper that she didn't know how to name. What would have happened if he'd forced his way in? She whispered. Mason shrugged, calm as still water. I'd have made sure he regretted it. Her voice trembled. For me? Why? He met her gaze with a steady warmth she felt down to her bones. Because nobody should stand alone against the winter, Ellie, not while I'm breathing. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stepped toward him, as if drawn by something she didn't have the strength to resist. Her fingers brushed his sleeve before she caught herself, pulling back with shy restraint. We should pack, she murmured. We will, he said softly. Tonight, we prepare. Tomorrow, we run. Outside, the wind rose again, whispering through the pine trees like a warning. Inside, Mason and Ellie stood facing each other, not just bound by danger now, but by the first threads of something far more powerful than fear. Something beginning. Dawn on the ridge came thin and gray, more a dim lifting of darkness than any true morning light. The wind had quieted, but the cold cut sharper than a knife, seeping straight through wool and fawn. Mason had been awake for hours, packing what little he owned into a single burlap sack-dried venison. Matches, a hatchet, 2 blankets. Not much, but it was everything. Ellie moved silently beside him, folding her parents' clothing, tying small bundles with trembling fingers. Her father slept, breath thin but steady. Her mother murmured prayers under her shawl, as though trying to weave protection into the threads. By the time the horizon paled to silver, Mason stepped outside to rent a wagon from a trapper who lived half a mile down the ridge. It cost more than he should have spent, but he didn't hesitate. When he returned, Ellie was standing at the doorway, her parents already bundled beneath coats and scarves, ready but frightened. "You sure about this?" she asked, voice tight as stretched wire. Mason nodded. "Safer out there than here. That man'll come back with company." Ellie swallowed and helped him guide her parents into the wagon. The wooden wheels creaked, half frozen, but held. Mason tied down the last bundle, checked the horse's reins, then climbed on to the front seat. "Stay low," he told Ellie as she settled beside him. "If anyone recognizes you, we're done." Snow crunched under the wheels as they rolled away from the cabin that, for a brief moment, had felt like a home. Ellie looked back once, eyes soft with longing. "I'll miss that place," she whispered. Mason didn't say it out loud, but he would too. They traveled for hours, the ridge shrinking behind them. Pines thinned, hills smoothed into long plains glazed with old snow and new frost. A hawk circled overhead. Lonely against the wide winter sky, the horse trudged through drifts up to its knees. Mason drove slow, careful not to strain the animal, scanning the horizon for riders. He saw nothing but open land. Still, unease hummed beneath his ribs. Ellie glanced at him. "You think they'll follow?" "If they guess where we're headed," Mason said. "But men like that prefer easy trails. This way's anything but easy." She pulled her shawl tighter. "I feel like I've put you in danger you never asked for." He kept his eyes ahead. "Danger's better company than loneliness." She blinked, surprised by the blunt honesty. "You mean that?" Mason exhaled, breath fogging before him. "Haven't had anyone beside me in a long time, Ellie. Feels different. Feels right." Ellie looked down, cheeks warming despite the cold. Around midday, they reached a stretch of high prairie that stretched like pale ocean, rolling out toward distant foothills. The air tasted cleaner here, quieter. Mason slowed the wagon and pointed ahead. "There's a hollow near that rise. Nobody goes there. Too far from town, too rough for ranchers. We'll build something small, just until your folks are strong enough." Ellie stared at the horizon where snow drifted across the land in soft sheets. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's empty," Mason corrected gently, "but emptiness can be a blessing." They drove until the shadows grew longer and the cold began to sting sharper. Mason finally reined the horse to a stop, at a slight dip in the land sheltered by a half-ring of bare aspens. "This'll do." He hopped down and helped Ellie's parents out first, carrying her father in his arms again. When the old man's legs buckled, Ellie followed, clutching blankets and the little bag of bread she'd baked that morning. Their breaths puffed into the air as Mason surveyed the area. "Wood's dry enough to build with. Might have to drag some from farther up, but it'll stand." Ellie knelt beside her mother, rubbing warmth into her hands. "Do you really think we can stay here? That no one will find us?" Mason frowned thoughtfully, scanning the open expanse. "They'll expect you to run toward people, Ellie. Toward towns. Toward help. Not into the middle of nowhere." Her gaze lingered on him. "Then, this is middle of nowhere?" Mason nodded, which makes it perfect. He set to work immediately, gathering downed logs, sorting pieces straight enough to serve as beams. His axe swung steady, clean, sending sharp thwacks echoing across the open prairie. Ellie watched him, strong shoulders moving beneath his worn coat, breath steady despite the cold. There was something grounding in the way he worked, as if building shelters were woven into his bones. By nightfall, Mason had set up the rough frame of a small lean-to and stacked enough wood for a fire. Ellie's mother warmed herself beneath blankets. Her father slept again, exhaustion heavy in his limbs. Ellie knelt at the fire pit while Mason coaxed a flame to life. Sparks leapt into the dusk, catching against the chill air. "You did all that in one afternoon," Ellie said softly. Mason shrugged. "It's not much. Just enough so you won't freeze tonight." It's more than anyone's ever done for us. He looked at her then, really looked at her wind-chapped cheeks, her tired eyes, her hands raw from labor and fear. You deserve better, he said quietly. Better than this? She asked with a faint smile. Better than running, Mason corrected. Better than feeling hunted. The fire flared, painting the snow in warm orange light. Ellie moved closer, rubbing her hands together. The moment held a strange tenderness, as if the world had shrunk to only the space between them. Mason, she murmured, you didn't have to bring us here. You didn't have to risk everything. He shook his head. Didn't feel like a choice. Her breath caught. Why? Why do all this for me, for us? Mason leaned back on his hands, eyes fixed on the fire. His voice came low, rough at the edges. Because you walked through my door, and suddenly the house didn't feel empty anymore. Ellie's heart thudded painfully, sweetly. She scooted a little closer, their knees brushing under the blankets. Mason, she whispered again, I don't know how to thank you. He glanced at her, warmth flickering in his eyes. You just did. The wind swept over the prairie, bending the aspens in a soft sigh. Above them, stars blinked awake. And for the first time since they fled the ruins of their old life, Ellie felt something more powerful than fear rising inside her. She felt hope. Winter loosened its grip slowly on the high prairie. Days remained bitter, but the sun lingered a little longer with each passing afternoon, casting gold across the snowfields and pulling mist from the frozen earth. Mason felt the change in the air before he saw it. The land was waking again, soft as a breath. Ellie felt it too. Her parents grew stronger each day. Mrs. Hargrove could walk the length of the fire pit without stopping. And Mrs. Hargrove, though still stiff, managed to sit upright, long enough to watch the sun setting behind the distant ridge. Ellie kept busy tending the small patch of earth beside the lean-to. She planted what seeds she'd brought, mostly herbs, a handful of hardy bulbs and, though nothing would sprout until spring, the simple act of arranging soil with her hands made the cabin site feel like a life, not just a hiding place. Mason built a sturdier cabin as the days passed, hauling heavier logs from the partially thawed creek bed, shaping them with the confident swing of a man who had carved his future from rougher materials than wood. Ellie watched him often, sometimes openly, sometimes when his back was turned, with a quiet admiration she could no longer deny. One evening, when the sky burned soft pink and lavender, Mason stood on the small rise overlooking their newly settled hollow. Ellie joined him, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders as the wind teased loose strands of her hair. Your father walked almost 100 feet today, Mason said gently. That's a fine sign. Ellie smiled, the fading sunlight catching in her eyes. He hasn't walked that far in months. He's stronger. We all are. Mason nodded toward the small cabin down the slope. Smoke curled from the chimney, warm and steady. Feels like home now, he said. Ellie looked at him. Home because you built it? He hesitated, then shook his head. Home because of the people in it. The wind softened. The world around them felt still quiet, in a way that wasn't lonely, just expectant. Mason. Ellie's voice was a mere breath. Do you really think they won't find us here? They'd have to cross half the prairie, he replied. No tracks out here, no neighbors, no reason for anyone to come this far. We're ghosts now, safe ones. Ellie let out a sigh that had been waiting in her chest for weeks. I never thought peace would feel like this. Not after everything. Mason studied her profile, the slope of her cheek, the faint trembling at her lips from the cold. You deserve peace, he said softly. And you? She asked. Do you? He turned away, as though searching the horizon for the answer. I don't know, he murmured. Haven't thought about my own wants in a long time. She stepped closer, voice steady despite her shaking hands. Then think about them now. Mason's breath caught. She was close enough that he could feel her warmth through the winter air, close enough that the soft scent of flour and smoke lingered around her, like something familiar. He swallowed once. Rough. Ellie, I've lived my life in quiet. Alone. Didn't think I'd get another chance at something better. She placed a hand on his arm. Gentle. Deliberate. You did, Mason. You changed my family's life. You salved us. If anyone deserves something better, it's you. He looked down at her hand, then into her eyes, and for the first time since he was a boy, he let himself hope for more than survival. Ellie, he whispered, being out here with you, I don't feel the cold the way I used to. Her breath trembled, but she didn't look away. I don't feel the fear the way I used to. Silence wrapped around them, soft, full, a quiet of promise. Then she asked, barely audible, would you ever tire of me? If we stayed together? If this became our life? Mason reached up, his fingers brushing her cheek like he was afraid she'd vanish into the wind if he pressed harder. No, he said, voice husky with truth. I spent too many years wishing for someone to share a sunrise with. Now that you're here, I don't wish for anything else. Ellie's eyes shone, brimmed with something bright and fragile and whole. Mason, she breathed, I want to stay with you. Not because we have nowhere else to go, but because with you I finally feel safe. His thumb traced the edge of her jaw, warm against her cold skin. Then stay, he whispered. Stay with me. Stay as long as you want. Stay until the prairie blooms again. Stay until we're old enough to laugh at how scared we once were. Ellie leaned into his touch, eyes closing for a heartbeat. He bent his forehead to hers. And under the fading blush of the winter sky, with the mountains standing like ancient guardians around them, Mason kissed her, slow, sure, full of everything he had never dared to hope for. She answered the kiss with a soft, grateful sigh, her fingers curling into the fabric of his coat, pulling him closer, as though anchoring her heart to his. When they finally separated, breath mingling in the cold air, Ellie whispered, Thank you for finding us, and for letting us find you. Mason held her close, feeling the truth of her words settle warm and deep in his chest. No, he murmured. Thank you for giving this place a reason to feel alive again. Below them, the small cabin glowed with lamplight. Above them, the first star broke through the dusk. And for the first time in a long, brutal season of fear, the world felt wide open, ready for their tomorrow. And so, on that quiet stretch of prairie beneath the wide western schema, Mason and Ellie began the life neither of them ever thought they'd find, built not from safety or certainty, but from courage, kindness, and a love strong enough to outlast any winter. May their story remind us that even in the loneliest corners of the world, a single open door can change everything. If you enjoyed this tale, please hit subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment so I can keep bringing you more stories. Thank you all for listening.